Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war. They're one-of-a-kind weapons, uniquely original prototypes built to test the new technologies. From the sands of Kitty Hawk to the final frontiers of deep space. Gold medal success stories and fist-pounding failures. They're the ancestors of today's awesome firepower. They're experimental weapons. Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war.
Technological advances are changing the many shapes, scope, and speed of warfare, literally turning science fiction into science fact. Weapons that, not too long ago, were only fanciful ideas are now commonplace. Stealth, Patriot, Apache. These complex, battle-proven systems incorporate technologies learned and perfected from a long line of prototypes. Yesterday's experimental weapons have redefined today's battlefield.
The laws by which these wings are manipulated are the old lost laws of Greek cosmic motion, which I have rediscovered.
No experiment has ever captured the imagination of scientists and daredevils as much as the quest for flight. By today's standards, these primitive prototypes seem comical, but we must remember, no standards had yet been set. These early pioneers were exploring the most basic principles of flight. Every experiment was a treacherous test flight. And every inventor was a brave test pilot. In the 1940s, the U.S. began testing a series of experimental aircraft designated as X-planes. The Bell X-1 was designed to investigate flight beyond the speed of sound. Very little was known about the aerodynamics necessary for supersonic flight, so the X-1's fuselage was modeled after an object able to travel at this velocity, the .50 caliber bullet.
Well, the shape was primarily the shape of a bullet. And they put wings on it and made it as strong as possible. And brute force with the rocket engines driving it through the speed of sound. And it was a brute force effort because the wings were really not optimized for transonic and supersonic flight.
The rocket-propelled aircraft was launched from the belly of a B-29. A special pit was built so the mothership could position itself over the plane, and the X-1 could be hoisted into the bomb bay. On October 14, 1947, piloted by Air Force Captain Chuck Yeager, the X-1 became the first aircraft to break the sound barrier, Mach 1.06, 700 miles per hour.
Okay, drop it, Danny. Drop.
Throughout the 40s and 50s, the X program continued with varying degrees of success. The swept-winged X-2 achieved speeds of Mach 3.2, but was plagued with crashes.
The X-3 was a different kind of airplane. That was to really look at some of the heating aspects of supersonic flight. It never panned out too well. We never got the engines, we never really got the performance out of the airplane that we wanted to get.
The X-4 explored the flight characteristics of tailless aircraft at near supersonic flight. And the X-5 became the first high-performance aircraft to use variable geometry wings.
Now I have the privilege of pressing the button which will bring out the question.
In 1959, the X-15 spearheaded research on aerodynamics, winged re-entry from space, and life support systems. The X-15 climbed to altitudes of over 67 miles and is the only aircraft ever to achieve hypersonic flight, over 6 times the speed of sound.
In describing an X-15 flight, the first shock, of course, was the launch. You're launched from a B-52 at 45,000 feet at 8/10 Mach number. And when you drop away, it's almost like you were shot down with a cannon. It's just a tremendous jolt. Right away, you try to get the engine lit, because if you don't get home. And once you get the engine lit, you're dealing with much higher thrust-to-weight ratios than you've ever dealt with before. You know, the acceleration forces pushing you back in the seat increased from 2G up close to 4G. And it was the first airplane I'd flown that I was happy to shut the engine off on. And the other problem was you lost the horizon right away as soon as you started the pull-up. So you were just going like hell, and you weren't sure where you were going.
The rocket engine of the aircraft would only burn for about 80 seconds before it ran out of fuel. Every landing was performed without power.
But once you shut the engine down or you ran out of fuel, there was no more engine in the airplane, and it was a glider from then on. And that's why every flight was a dead stick landing. But that's, you know, to pilots, that's a rather significant thing. But to the X-15, it was a planned dead stick landing. So it wasn't an emergency as a normal fighter pilot thinks of a dead stick landing. So it really wasn't as bad as it sounds. Although you couldn't make any mistakes. You had to hit the lake bed, and you had to make sure that the first one was a good one.
In later models, external fuel tanks were added so the engine could burn longer and higher speeds could be attained. On November 3, 1967, Colonel Pete Knight took the X-15 to Mach 6.7, 4,520 miles per hour, a speed record that still stands today.
It's exciting, it's exhilarating, it's scary, and if you don't have a certain amount of fear on each one of the flights, then there's something wrong with you. We flew 199 flights. We did numerous experiments, both within the atmosphere as well as outside of the atmosphere. There were a number of areas that the X-15 excelled in, and the data collected, I think, will be examined and analyzed for years to come.
Today, the X program continues. The X-29 uses a forward-swept wing design. Compared to conventional wings, forward wings provide exceptional maneuverability. Forward wing aircraft are virtually spin-proof. The X-31 EFM, Enhanced Fighter Maneuverability, is the first international X-plane, a joint development project between the United States and Germany. Agility is the goal of this aircraft. Thrust vectoring and computerized flight controls allow the X-31 to turn tighter and point at targets more quickly. On America's drawing boards is the X-30, National Aerospace Plane. This aircraft will be capable of taking off from a runway, traveling into space, and then landing back on a runway. The X-30 will attain speeds in excess of 17,000 miles per hour, more than 30 times faster than today's jet airliners.
The X-30 is rich in the tradition of the X-airplanes. It's breaking new ground, going faster and further than any other X-airplane has in the past. The requirements for the air-breathing propulsion components, as well as the materials technology required to build the structure of the aircraft because of the very high heating conditions that the airplane will have to endure on its way to space, is all very leading-edge technology.
No existing wind tunnel can duplicate the extreme conditions of an X-30 flight. Supercomputers are being used to simulate the intense shock waves and 5,000-degree heat the aircraft will face. Eventually, space planes will be used to launch and retrieve satellites, as well as ferry crews to orbiting space stations. At the moment, no specific military mission is planned for the aircraft, but such convenient access to high altitudes could greatly increase the use of space weapons in the next century. The first national aerospace plane is scheduled for test flights in the late 1990s.
Experimental weapons will continue in a moment here on A&E.
From the earliest days of aviation, vertical flight has been a dream of experimental researchers.
If you stop to think about it, if anybody wants to fly, the best way to fly would be to go straight up, go where you want, and come straight down. And that was always in the heart of inventors. Leonardo da Vinci sketched a helicopter. Even the very earliest of the great aviation pioneers, Louis Breguet, Igor Sikorsky, were fascinated by the idea of vertical flight and attempted helicopters.
In 1907, Louis Breguet's design was the first helicopter to leave the ground with a pilot. However, it was extremely unstable, and a practical helicopter was a long way off.
There were three difficulties. One, it was difficult to get an engine powerful enough to lift the aircraft up. Two, not enough was known about the rotors in it to really do it effectively. And three, stability was a problem that they really didn't understand until they began to fly a little bit. It was difficult to project this. There were helicopters inventors in almost every country, but no real progress was made on helicopters until the 30s.
Breguet successfully continued his work, but some of the most interesting experiments took place in Germany.
One of the pioneering test pilots of that period was Hanne Reich, a dedicated pilot, a dedicated Nazi, who came to fame by flying a helicopter around the Great Hall in Berlin, the first indoor flight of a helicopter.
These early designs convinced the German military that the helicopter was a viable weapon of war. The FA-223 transport became the first helicopter to enter military service. The German Navy also built portable helicopters to be carried aboard ship and used for anti-submarine warfare. In the United States, Igor Sikorsky solved many of the problems of helicopter design with his VS-300. Sikorsky realized the key to success was the proper relationship between the vertical tail rotor and the main rotor. By the spring of 1941, Sikorsky had overcome most of the obstacles that hampered earlier inventors, but the unpredictability of his VS-300 did not dampen his enthusiasm for the helicopter.
I remember a good friend of mine and a very prominent designer, scientist in aviation asked, when would the helicopter go faster than the airplane? Do you know that? I said, yes, I know. The answer is never. When would the helicopter be more efficient than the airplane? Do you know that? I also said, yes, I know that. Never. But I said that helicopter will do a number of jobs which no airplane will do, and which in fact nothing else will do except the helicopter. So that the idea that a vertical lift aircraft that was one of my dreams. I wanted to do that as long as I'm alive. What kind of a gadget or machine can give you unlimited freedom of transportation?
Every test flight, successful or not, led to further refinements in the stability of his invention. The mechanism that Sikorsky pioneered to control the pitch of these blades is still used today. In May of 1942, Igor Sikorsky delivered an improved version of his VS-300 to the United States Army Air Corps. The YR-4, or Hoverfly, proved so successful during test flights that the Army ordered 100 into production.
We had to hold on to this thing to make sure that it would do what we wanted it to. You never dared let go of the controls. You never dared take your eye off the horizon, which is all you could fly by. There weren't any instruments, any flight instruments. The worst thing was learning how to hover. And learning how to hover is sort of like learning how to ride a bicycle at very slow speed. You can do it after a little practice. And what you try to do is to hold it still, and it starts to drift. There's a gust of wind or something moves you sideways, and so you correct, and zoom, off you go the other direction, and then you come back. And we used to see this very dangerous being on the flight strip during those days, because these things would be zooming all over the place. People, the pilots, the student pilots, overcorrecting.
Carter Harmon piloted his R-4 on the first helicopter combat rescue mission. In 1944, he evacuated a downed pilot and 4 passengers from behind enemy lines in Burma. With the AH-64 Apache, the helicopter has evolved into one of the most potent weapons on today's battlefield. Experimentation is being conducted to make it even more lethal. This new modification is called Longbow. Mounted on a mast above the rotors, Longbow is a radar system that can detect ground and air targets even through darkness, adverse weather, and battlefield smoke. It will instantly categorize the targets, determine their priority, and feed the data to the Apache's Hellfire missiles, which then guide themselves to their target.
The helicopter has the ability to be agile, to use the earth, the folds in the earth, trees, and other obstructions, to be able to sneak up on its enemy, fire its missiles, and retreat. Since the Second World War, the tank has been considered the queen of the battlefield. The helicopter, the modern attack helicopter, is perhaps the crown princess and going to take over that role from the tank by the end of the century.
Experimental weapons will continue in a moment here on A&E.
Military designers have long been trying to combine the vertical takeoff and landing and hover capabilities of a helicopter with the high speed, high altitude, long-range cruise capabilities of an airplane. These aircraft are known as VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing.
Okay, John, give her a little power. Pick her up a little more. Keep her up. Keep your nose up. Your nose up. Atta boy. All right, let's come off the power. Take it easy. Down.
The XFY-1 Pogo was developed for the U.S. Navy as a means to save space on carrier flight decks. The Pogo made the first of many successful VTOL flights in August 1954. However, the program was eventually canceled because it took exceptional piloting to fly the aircraft.
Keep her straight now. Easy on the controls, John. Easy on the controls. Bring her down, boy. Not too much. Atta boy. Okay, cut.
The first jet VTOL aircraft was the Ryan X-13 Vertijet. The X-13 took off and landed on a portable platform. On July 30th, 1957, the aircraft was demonstrated at the Pentagon. To underscore the remarkable new technology, the 7-minute flight retraced the route taken some 48 years earlier by Orville Wright and Benjamin Falloy when making the acceptance flight of the first military aircraft. In 1957, the Bell X-14 became the first vertical takeoff aircraft to fly using a system that diverts the thrust of its jet engine. The X-14 flew for nearly a quarter of a century with few accidents and no major injuries. Data gathered through these experiments paved the way for today's British Harrier, which proved so successful in close air support missions during Desert Storm.
There were a number of airplanes that had the ability to take off vertically. And they have a purpose, they have a mission. And the whole idea being that you're not bound by a 8,000-foot runway, which is rather vulnerable in time of war. So there are a great many advantages to that kind of a system. But you also pay a penalty for it. You never get anything for free. And to be able to take off vertically costs you significantly in payload and range, because it takes so much fuel to be able to take off vertically.
The XV-3 was designed to evaluate the tilting rotor approach to VTOL. The propeller rotor units provided vertical lift, then angled forward for conventional flight. In the 1970s, the XV-15 continued research on the tilt rotor design. It was hoped this technology could be applied to a flexible transport and rescue aircraft.
In the early vertical takeoff aircraft, they weren't too successful. A lot of them had major problems, and a lot of them had accidents. It wasn't really until recently, when they got into the tilt rotor, that it looked like we had something that really will work. We know a lot more about some of the problems nowadays, and we provide, say, more control power for the pilot to overcome some of these problems that they ran into in the early aircraft.
All these have led to the development of today's V-22 Osprey for the United States Marine Corps.
This aircraft, which developed out of a US Marine Corps requirement to replace its troop-lifting helicopters, is one of the leading edges of technology. Basically, it's the sort of technology that no country can afford to be without. It combines all the values of vertical takeoff and landing in a helicopter with the forward flight capabilities of a turbine-engined aircraft. So in other words, you can take off vertically from the aircraft carrier deck at 250 miles, fly at low level at high speed, and land vertically to deposit troops or equipment in a combat area. It would make marine operations, army operations, so very much easier if it comes into service. Of course, it's new technology and it's expensive, but it's the sort of technology which I think the Americans are going to progress. It's the sort of technology that if the Soviets were still in the Brezhnev era, they'd be throwing money at as if it was going out of fashion.
In the 1950s, the U.S. Navy experimented with another method of flexible takeoff and landing. The Sea Dart became the first seaplane to break the sound barrier.
Navy Screen Highlights. The Navy has found a new way to navigate swamps, marshes, mud, water, and deep snow. It's the Marsh Screw Amphibian.
Over the years, there have been many unusual methods for traversing difficult terrain. Some of the most interesting experiments have been with hovercraft, vehicles that ride on a cushion of air over land or sea. To look at these early designs, it seems unlikely that the hovercraft could ever become a viable weapon of war. However, today, the air cushion vehicle has revolutionized the strategy of amphibious warfare.
The air cushion vehicle basically uses ducted fans to blow downward and lift the vehicle off the ground on a cushion of air which is kept under the vehicle by a skirt. The propeller and the rudder, acting exactly the way they do in an airplane, drives the vehicle over the water. Now the interesting thing is that the vehicle can go right up on land and can negotiate obstacles.
The development of the LCAC air cushion vehicle, which has a 40-plus knot capability and can achieve over-the-horizon landings because of the high speed of the landing craft, giving a great element of surprise. And they can also proceed inland in the same vehicles beyond the surf zone, which has always been a critical zone and difficult to handle men and cargo in the surf zone, to a good, safe landing area where there's tractability for vehicles and it's dry and you're not facing the ocean behind you.
17 of the U.S. Navy's LCACs saw action for the first time in Operation Desert Storm. On the second day of the ground war, they landed the 5th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, comprised of 7,300 men, plus weapons and supplies, on the Kuwait-Saudi border. Even in such a limited support role, the LCACs intimidated the Iraqi forces.
Experimental weapons will continue in a moment here on A&E.
On the battlefield, the need for accurate and timely intelligence about an enemy has directed much experimentation toward airborne reconnaissance. From their vantage point high above the front lines of World War I, German airship captains improvised what was described as the loneliest assignment of the war. Lowered by a winch from its mother ship, an observer rode in a tiny aluminum car dangling from a steel cable nearly a half-mile long. With the airship safely hidden from view, the cloud car spotter could telephone back the location of enemy targets. As dangerous as it must have been, the job had no shortage of volunteers. It seems the crews relished the chance to drift far below the hydrogen-filled mothership and enjoy a pastime that was strictly forbidden above, smoking a cigarette. With reliable airplanes and portable cameras, airborne observers could be sent to collect information when it was most needed and return with irrefutable proof of their sightings. But as enemy air defense weapons grew more accurate, the reconnaissance aircraft were forced to fly higher and faster to stay out of range of the anti-aircraft artillery and surface-to-air missiles. In 1955, the Air Force experimented with a high-altitude photo-reconnaissance jet. Long, graceful wings were designed to keep the U-2 aloft in the thin atmosphere at 85,000 feet. In 1962, U-2 photos revealed a number of Soviet long-range nuclear missiles in place in Cuba. In the 1960s, the SR-71 Blackbird reconnaissance plane was developed as a result of the X-15 research. Traveling at over Mach 3, the Blackbird's titanium fuselage grew so hot, the aircraft actually stretched 11 inches in flight. The SR-71 was recently retired. However, to this day, no jet aircraft has flown faster. But the quest for higher and therefore safer altitudes pushed designers to take their experiments into outer space. Advancements in computer technology revolutionized the capability of photo reconnaissance satellites.
Despite the fact that the satellites are in a higher orbit, their optical systems are sufficiently good so that the pictures they produce have more detail in them than the pictures produced by a U-2 or an SR-71.
The most capable system used by private industry is a French satellite named SPOT.
SPOT acquires the most detailed imagery that's commercially available in the world. The smallest object that you can detect on the ground is about 10 meters on a side, or 30 feet. You can easily see roads or paths. You can easily see boats and the wakes that they leave, so you can tell the direction they're moving in. Because we provide a very large area view, which is very easy to manipulate and use, the Defense Department uses our imagery in conjunction with other intelligence gathering and information gathering technologies during the time of the Persian Gulf crisis. We were able to provide very up-to-date imagery for those who were involved in the Allied efforts over there to supplement the maps that they had, which in many cases were not up-to-date. We could also trace the progress of the war by literally the tracks that were left in the sands over there by the Iraqi tank columns.
You can kind of gauge by the numbers of tracks here that there must have been literally hundreds of armored vehicles that cut across in various elements. You can see where they joined up in some cases and then split up again as they came across the border.
That desert forms a real nice canvas for showing those features.
Of most interest here is this military facility. It was a Kuwaiti airfield, now occupied by the Iraqis. You can see the hardened aircraft shelters here on both sides of the runway with the angled taxiways.
Its cameras do not expose film. SPOT transmits its images to ground-based receiving stations. If necessary, the electronic images can be printed and distributed on traditional photographic paper. The data can be enhanced and manipulated in the computer to reveal critical information.
During the Desert Storm operation over Baghdad, before the bombing, there were 3 bridges that are fairly close to one another on the Tigris River, and they are intact in January. We can see a fairly dramatic comparison later in March as we zoom in and get closer and closer in and magnify the detail in that image. We can in fact see the damage actually occurred to the bridges.
We can provide imagery that was used extensively to evaluate the success or failure of an attack mission, and then they can make a decision whether they need to go in and do some additional bombing in an area. And that's a good example of how information is derived from SPOT, and then a decision is made based on that information.
Desert Storm proved the value of satellites for navigation, reconnaissance, and target acquisition. In the Gulf War, soldiers carried Navstar global positioning systems. With small handheld receivers, infantrymen could determine their precise position even through blinding sandstorms. The system operates by triangulation, listening to signals from 3 or more satellites orbiting 11,000 miles above the Earth, and then calculating position to within about 100 meters.
We were flying anything up to 250 miles over utterly flat sand without a single feature to navigate by at all. So without GPS, to find something at the other end of that 250 miles would have been nigh on impossible.
Navigation was a big problem. We had compasses and maps, but a map of the desert is really like looking at a sheet of sandpaper. Without it in the desert, if we didn't have had it with us, then we'd probably still be there now, I think, bumbling around.
Much has been said about the use of space-based weapons on the future battlefield. With the easing of Cold War tensions, the controversial Strategic Defense Initiative will perhaps no longer emphasize its original role, the use of space-based laser beams to halt a nuclear attack.
There's some sentiment that you don't really need it anymore because of the end of the Cold War and the Russians won't be firing it. But probably when one thinks of the proliferation of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons to third world countries, it might be that something like SDI is more valuable now than it had been during the time of the Cold War. Just to be sure that some
third world country doesn't launch a missile, it could cause billions of casualties.
Experimental weapons will continue in a moment here on A&E.
Let's go, let's go! Stand by, fire!
In warfare, there is no substitute for superior firepower. During Desert Storm, the high-tech artillery weapons of the coalition forces performed with devastating precision. Saddam Hussein hoped to counter with a gigantic cannon capable of engaging targets well over 100 miles away. When segments of the gun barrel were discovered, Hussein claimed they were merely being used to repair an oil pipeline. Like similar experiments of the past, this supergun was less a product of a shrewd military mind and more a result of an enormous ego. In World War I, the Paris gun was used as a terror weapon against the people of Paris.
It consisted of a very, very, very long gun barrel. I think it was 156 calibers long, whereas most guns at the time were 30 or 40 calibers was long. And from a range of 72 miles and hidden away in a forest, it could literally rain shells on Paris. It was 72 miles away from the front line, but the number of casualties inflicted on Paris and the citizens was relatively minor, although it was an extraordinary technical feat for the time. Its military effectiveness was virtually nil.
In World War II, Hitler had his own supergun called Gustav.
The 80-centimetre railway gun is a subject of fascination to anybody interested in artillery matters. It was the biggest gun of all time, and that's sort of sole reason why it was built. It was a Wagnerian obsession by Hitler and the Nazi regime to have something that was bigger, that would really be absolutely the greatest gun of all time. And it was a whopper. The shells were taller than a man. The calibre, the actual width of the barrel was 800 millimetres. To actually service and manage it took a battalion manpower strength. And it was only ever used once in action, and that was Sevastopol in 1943. It was very, very effective, but the actual manpower resources of getting that gun across Europe and actually getting it into action and firing it was such that it actually diverted manpower away from the main attack. I always like to think that gun helped the Allies win the Second World War in its own quiet way.
As the age of atomic weapons emerged, scientists soon discovered that artillery could harness this awesome power. The 280-millimeter gun, known as Atomic Annie, became the first piece of artillery to fire a shell capable of delivering a nuclear payload.
That shell could easily be delivered by a rocket. It could be delivered by an aircraft. Where the gun, the atomic gun, or atomic cannon, call it what you will, scores over those methods, is that you can keep on delivering them accurately at any time of the day or night, under any circumstances. And that's it even now. Conventional artillery can fire atomic projectiles, and many, many guns in the field are equipped with atomic projectiles even to this day. But Atomic Annie was so big and so heavy, it was difficult to move, and it fell out into disuse, not because it was an atomic gun, but because it was such a bitch to move.
The potential to destroy whole cities with a single bomb became the ultimate projection of military power. The nuclear bomber had become the most lethal weapon in the U.S. arsenal. In 1946, Northrop Aircraft debuted its version of the bomber of the future, the XB-35 Flying Wing. Jack Northrop had argued for years that a flying wing was superior to an aircraft with tail surfaces that produced so much drag. The Air Force converted two of the wings to jet propulsion. The flying wing's speed increased to 520 miles per hour, but the gas-guzzling jets cut the craft's range in half.
Flying wing, of course, one of the great romantic concepts of all time. John Northrop was a lovable guy. The Flying Wing was an exotic airplane that everybody wanted to see succeed. And the truth is, it probably came within just a few years of succeeding because it just missed the development of stability augmentation, the black boxes that would have taken away its tendency to be a little difficult on the bomb runs and instead made it an appropriate bomber.
Amid much controversy, the Flying Wing was shelved for a time. Since the late 40s, nothing has influenced American bomber design more than the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Soviets' first MiG-15 jet fighter was cause for concern. One proposal to counter the MiG threat was the XF-85 Goblin. This parasite escort was designed to ride underneath the B-29. If a MiG-15 was identified, the Goblin would swoop down and attack the Russian jet with 4 machine guns. Unfortunately, the Goblin was little more than a flying jet engine and had poor handling characteristics. Like the Flying Wings before it, the program was discontinued, and the Air Force canceled its order for 30 more Goblins in 1947. By the early 60s, the Soviets' air defense network had become more complex than ever. The surface-to-air missile was emerging as a threat greater than MiG fighters. The Air Force was convinced a high-altitude supersonic plane could outpace the missiles and replace the B-52 fleet. North American aviation soon began development of the XB-70 Valkyrie, a futuristic bomber capable of flying 3 times the speed of sound. Although the XB-70 was a stunning technological achievement, the Soviets shot down a high-flying American U-2 spy plane 2 years earlier. This confirmed the fear that a combination of radar, computers, and surface-to-air missiles had made Soviet air penetration suicidal at best. In 1964, the XB-70 program was canceled.
The XB-70, the Valkyrie, actually added a lot to American understanding of high-speed flight, particularly for larger aircraft. And really, you can almost look upon the XB-70 program as not trying to develop a strategic bomber, but also one of aerodynamic research in engine design, in wing design, and the use of new materials. And like everything in aerospace, even when the project's cancelled, a lot's learned just from that data of the aircraft flying or even just being on the drawing board.
But of course, the ultimate defense for any bomber is to be virtually invisible. One of the most dramatic futuristic designs of any weapon in the world today is the B-2 stealth bomber. Funding for the controversial project has continued, emphasizing a new role. The B-2 is being slated for use in regional conflicts like the Gulf War, not for penetrating Soviet radar during a nuclear war. Of course, all experimental programs come with a high degree of risk. In April 1992, during a test flight, America's F-22 Advanced Tactical Fighter crashed on the runway at Edwards Air Force Base. Fortunately, the pilot survived.
We are pushing the envelope. That's the most sophisticated advanced airplane known to man. We have every kind of technology in the world in there. And I would have preferred to never have seen that picture. But that's life, that's flight test, and that's when you start pushing technology, those things do happen.
The F-22 program will continue.
A wrong answer is knowledge also. You know, if something doesn't work right, fine. You want to know that too. We don't intend to have crashes, obviously, in flight research, but if you aren't sticking your neck out a little bit, you really aren't moving ahead.
The effective life of new technology is getting shorter and shorter. Radical innovations are already sending many of the weapons that performed so well in the Gulf War to the scrap heap. To stop experimenting with technology would mean losing an already precarious edge. In the laboratory, scientists are already fighting and perhaps deciding tomorrow's war.
Monday, what were the causes of World War II? Conflicts in Europe come to a head on David L. Wolfer Presents. Then a cyclist is spinning his wheels over a beautiful girl, but switches gears when he's accused of threatening her life. Jeremy Brett comes to the rescue on Sherlock Holmes Mysteries. Now stay tuned for A&E's An Evening at the Improv, next on A&E.